The importance of this meeting and of protecting elections is in terms of aligning us behind terms, because some terms are quite sophisticated and they do have a meaning which connect to conceptual thinking and programming and so on. And this is why it is important to start any discussion by kind of aligning with the terms. But terms are very difficult, right? So the three terms with which we operate, and again, we started risk management, and the director from the Ministry of Finance, when we met, he was like really interesting to see, because he found all international idea guides and policy papers and guides on risk factors and everything. So he really went and he appreciated it. So we are working 10 years with the risk management or more, but now we decided to put in resilience building and crisis management, right? And hopefully that will also make a sense to you. But the risk management is the backbone of everything, right? So what is electoral risk? And there are so many definitions, and all definitions are right or good in terms of whether the organization's context, publications that they are used. But we kind of like a simple one to say risk is a situation that can occur and negatively affect the electoral process. So it is a likelihood of negative occurrence. A risk is something that can negatively affect the electoral process. Now, where is the difference between the risk and the threat? Threat is situation or actor that can exploit electoral vulnerabilities. Right? When you say threat, it's not a risk, but it's not very different from a risk. And then crisis is situation that combines a sense of urgency and high uncertainty. So these definitions are just slightly tuned to electoral processes, which has here electoral processes, electoral occurrences, and so on. Now, and I also very often kind of confuse them, need to remind myself, okay, this is how it is, this is what it is. But this is probably something to remember always. When we talk about risk, that is something that may or may not happen. Risk is really safe category to say this can happen, like the negative occurrence. Now with the electoral threat, that can be something that is happening or it is very likely to happen. And that was, for example, on the Fonto and I, when we were like having risk management events, like meeting sessions in other countries in Africa. We said, risk, this may or may not happen. They said, no, we really want to talk about things that are happening. Yeah, but what's happening is really not risk. Let's talk about risk. No, we want to talk about the threats. And we said, okay, so we kind of need to go beyond talking about risk and be able to engage and advise them on how to deal with the threats, right? But then, in the COVID time, and IDEA has done a lot of research, and my colleague Eric was kind of looking and leading that research on the COVID, which was a crisis, which was planetary crisis in terms of every elections that had to navigate through COVID, whether you postpone elections or you decide to go on. There was a crisis situation, and crisis is something that is happening or may not happen. So this is may or may not happen. This is happening or very likely to happen. And crisis can be all. It can be present, it can be future that may or may not happen. And then there is a thing which is called electoral risk factors or risk factor. Right? That is something that increases risk. And again, there are many different concepts. I hope kind of it connects with your thinking or there is a good overlap, because the literature is so broad, and we actually look into ISO and COSO, what was the name? Yes, and so we look into all literature and kind of try to find something which is simple, something which is manageable, because we understand we are not you in terms of your expertise, knowledge, education, and we kind of try to bring the two worlds together. Right? So what is the relationship between risk, threats, and crisis? And I had like I was playing with different slides. And last evening I made this one. So you'll see, it's interesting. So what is the risk? What is your risk? We don't have a time kind of to go around. I would wish if we had. But let's say the risk is that electoral integrity may be undermined. It's a fair thing to say. It may or may not be. We say that it just could. And that's the case in every country. In every country in the world, electoral integrity is being undermined. But then, what are the risk factors? When are we kind of jumping from, when are we actually dealing with the threat? Or when do we know that we are dealing with a crisis? And remember, like these were the definitions that I offered in the previous slide. So the case is, I didn't really know that we will have very elaborate discussion on ballot papers. But let's say, the risk is that ballot papers are not delivered to polling stations on election day. It can happen, I think, in every country. That could be a risk. Now, when do we know that we are dealing with a threat? You were talking about employees, you know. So working in the printing company or your printing department are preparing for or have started a strike. Now, that's a threat, that's not a risk, right? Because we are beyond, it may or may not happen, it is very likely to happen. And then this is the vulnerability. Your vulnerability is that the ballot papers are not on the polling station. And when are we dealing with the crisis? Now, ballot papers are printed too late to deliver them to polling station in time, or they are not printed at all. Like, that's your crisis. You kind of manage, and then you say, okay, now we know, for example, colleagues from the infrastructure, Ministry of Infrastructure, they will say, it takes us 2 days or 3 days to move them from the printing company to every polling station. And then you have 1 day, right? Because there was strike, there was negotiation, something. So this is where you are in the crisis situation. And say, it's very sense of urgency and very high uncertainty, right? So that's the crisis. And in the electoral processes, like you can, and this is what we will do in the afternoon, right? So we will look into what other examples we will try to order them and so on. So, but remember, there is chronology here. You may end up here without ever thinking about connecting that the strike may lead to this, or that ever thinking that it could possibly happen in the country. So there is chronology, kind of, if you end up here, you can probably stretch your head, and this is what Commissioner said, like that was the first, like maybe, if I just thought I could have prevented it, like, how come no one has thought about it, you know? And this is the process. So when I start presenting like on the risk management, I said, people, there is a good news and bad news. The bad news that risk management, resilience building, crisis management, it's complicated. Good news is that we do it all the time, right? We just kind of don't do it in a very formal way and methodological and so on. So there is this chronology. So how do we deal with the risk, threats, and crisis? Well, there are processes. There are ISO standards. There are also ISO standards for resilience building. But ISO standards for resilience building, they are actually referring to, yes, there is organizational resilience, but also resilience. You can't be resilient if you are working in the system and you are dependent on so many different elements in the system. So the best way to build your resilience is to make sure that the other elements, because you are working in the ecosystem, this is what you are electoral ecosystem. You need to make sure, because printing company is where your resilience is, not only what you do, and the police is your resilience, and Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Finance, and so on. So thinking about system, if I want to be resilient, if I want to be resilient to a virus, then I would be more resilient if people around me are healthy. If everyone is infected, like, you know, I will be very exposed, right? So what is the risk management process? So there is a framework, and this is super important. We were so happy that we had discussion the last time around. And the risk management process, and we are talking about the process. So risk management framework kind of follows the process. And if you go to internet, you just Google, there would be like 100 different schemes of the risk management, but it usually comes to the simple one to 4 to 5 elements. So identify risks. This is what we will do today. And then we will classify them. But then the second would be a risk assessment, risk analysis. How do you communicate? And then how do you treat this? So there is a process which is very methodological and so on. And the second one is how do you build resilience? So when you can, in terms of risk treatment, you can escalate it. And we heard from Ministry of Finance when we discussed this, well, you escalated. So you escalated kind of to resilience building. And there is a thing about how do you build your resilience? And resilience, according to, and this is more like in the literature, is exhibited through 3 types of responses. First, you resist, right? You resist, I resist by catching the virus. Then adjust, so you do things a little bit differently, or transform. You just change the way how you do things. And then crisis management process, which again has its own flow in terms of being prepared, and when the crisis hits, like knowing how to respond. As you said, there is a paralysis. So it's better to think how do we respond to something when we have a time, in a relaxed atmosphere, rather than everyone is calling, there is a crowd gathering and so on. So what would be, how do we connect it to the previous case? So in terms of a risk management process, right? So risk management would kind of think about a risk that ballot papers may not be printed in time. Then through risk management process, you would try to, for this risk and other, to collect and analyze information in order for you to take timely and informed decisions to prevent or escalate. Right? This is a risk management process in its nutshell. What would it be here? Like, how would we build a resilience in the face of the threat resulting from this kind of being materialized? Well, how do we resist? And the resist is like we just move on as we do, like we don't change. Maybe it's forbid strike or meet the demands, right? So that would be strategy for you to say, because you have this short period of time, if you want to have your ballot papers printed, I mean, this is not what I suggest, because second one would be probably in some countries would be better. So to adjust, to say, maybe we are dependent on one company that is producing ballot papers, and then maybe we should diversify. Maybe we should have more suppliers. So this gives you flexibility a little bit to go either way. And the third one is to transform. How can we do things differently? Transformation is how do we change ourselves? Well, to say, what? Let's not have ballot papers at all. Let's buy electronic voting machines so people go there and press the button, and we have resolved the problem. Now, what often happens, and it's a very long story, you can build your resilience to something, but then create vulnerability to something else, because you kind of close one gap, but then with electronic voting machines, there is a whole set of risks and challenges, and you need to make sure that when you fix one thing, you don't kind of you don't create a new problem. And this is why it is important to have integrated risk reduction frameworks and registers and so on to make sure that everything is nicely balanced. And then crisis management process. What is, for one example, is if-then plan. If this happens, who needs to be involved in overcoming crisis? Is it something that state agencies, maybe we need parliament to come in, maybe it's citizen, maybe it's woman, man, like we just don't know. Communications channels, who communicates, who can say, who calls someone, who speaks with the journalist, and so on and so on. And then how do you learn from it? So risk classification that we will do today will be one way of pointing, like, when do you keep something in your risk management, or when do you maybe you are facing some risk which you can immediately escalate and start preparing, thinking about resilience building and crisis management. Now, definition therefore of protecting elections is that protecting elections is defined as effort to prevent, withstand, or recover from negative occurrences that can undermine electoral integrity. You know, this definition now, if I showed you this definition at the beginning of my presentation, it would be good, but now you know, like, that every term has its depth, has a process behind it, and so on. So this is what you would like to see. Now, think of this electoral process. This is Australian example. So, like, people don't know. It's really hard to understand the scope of the process and activities. But here, in 15 activities, they have infograph of what needs to be done from the time when federal elections are announced. Election communication needs to take place, voter enrollment, nomination of candidates, ballot paper production, voting commences. You see, voting commences is step 6 of the process, because they have 50 million ballots produced, they have 2.5 million early voters, then there is 1 million of people who need to vote through postal voting, and then there is preparing for a polling day, election day, and so on. So you see, these are all terms, and every of these terms or milestone has so many risks, right, connected to it. And then they end up just being in election pack up as number 15.